So I mentioned in my video on Friday on how C.S. Lewis's idea of the Great Divorce connects to James Carse's idea of the infinite game. That another idea that is basically the infinite game is Kimberle Crenshaw's original idea of intersectionality, but also that basically everybody I've seen in the wild gets this exactly backwards and recreates the problems that she was trying to address. And so I wanted to quickly go over what was actually in mainly her 1989 paper. I'll talk about the 1991 a little bit, but most of her ideas can be found from the 1989 paper. And then how I've actually seen intersectionality presented in the wild, which I've seen two schools of thought. And I've written a more detailed 5,000-word post on my Substack, which you can also read. So this is going to be just a quicker summary. So Crenshaw's first paper, so there are two papers, a 1989 one and a 1991 one. And I just printed out the first page of this 1991 one because I have it in a book that I'll show you in a moment. So this paper is 30 pages. This one is 60 pages. And half of this one is basically a case law review that establishes three facts, which are that courts in the US had ruled that black women could not be class representatives on the basis of sex discrimination lawsuits. Black women could not be class representatives on the basis of race discrimination lawsuits. And black women did not constitute a class who could be discriminated against in situations where someone was hiring white women and black men, but not black women. And so that is all that you need for the first 11 pages to basically understand it. And then the remaining 18 pages, a lot of which is footnotes and you don't need to read. It's, I would say, pretty easy to read, and I would encourage you to consider reading it now. I'll link it in the description, starting from the last paragraph on page 11. But if you don't want to read it, I will summarize. Basically, I was going to draw and illustrate these things, and I decided I won't get to doing this if I keep wanting to do that. So for this video, at least, I'm just going to explain. But there are three things in this paper in the second half that are really critical to understanding the idea of intersectionality. And so the first one is what I call the allegory of the intersection, which is when you have a car accident at an intersection, you can't always determine which driver caused it. And so saying that black women can't sue for discrimination on the basis of sex or race unless they show clearly which it is like saying that a hospital, an ambulance, will not treat a patient at a car accident until they determine which of the other drivers in a multi-car pileup is at fault. And then you have the allegory of the basement, which basically says, imagine a basement where people with more and more disadvantages are stacked on top of each other all the way down. And the ceiling of the basement is the floor for the people who are not disadvantaged. And so they open the door between the floor/ceiling, and they let out the people who, but for that one disadvantage, would be in the room. And so they help up the people who are disadvantaged in only one way, the but-for scenario, but everyone below who's multiply disadvantaged and their discrimination is based on that, well, you can't show which one, so they are completely ignored, and it goes down kind of indefinitely. And then the last thing to get is what I call the call for the infinite game. And that's on page 30, so very end of it, the last couple paragraphs, where she is saying basically discrimination law works like with this dungeon, the basement, where you're starting with the least disadvantaged, the ones who it's easiest to see and helping up. But if you start with removing barriers that affect the most disadvantaged people, it would lift everybody. And that is an idea that sounds good in theory. As I say in my blog post, there are practical problems with it. It's operating from the unconstrained vision, which I keep mentioning in this book. It's been really helpful for me for understanding a lot of where ideas that I like don't quite work, and ideas that I don't like but can't quite explain what's going on. And this is an example of, I like the idea of intersectionality as Crenshaw explains it, but starting from the assumption like you can go right to the most disadvantaged, that's not really practical, I don't think. But it's a good starting place, because basically what she's saying is imagine the infinite game where we remove the barriers for everyone. Everyone was able to get work. Everyone was able to participate in social institutions. And again, that is a vision of the infinite game. And so she also wrote her 1991 paper where she expanded on a lot of these ideas. And there's two other things in the 1989 paper I'm not getting into here, but I do talk about a little bit in my blog post. And this one is the one that is in this collection I have of key essays and papers in critical race theory. So what I have actually seen in practice is that almost exclusively in the wild, both proponents and critics of intersectionality have one of two interpretations. One of these misinterpretations is what I call the listen and believe account of intersectionality, where it's basically saying you don't know what intersections someone has, so if someone is telling you their experience, just believe them, even if it doesn't match with your experience, your intuitions of what might actually happen. And so I have a pragmatic problem with this, which is that there are definitely people who either play the victim or at least are energy vampires, and you can pretty quickly pick up the patterns. Like, it doesn't even matter the specifics, it's how they approach their problems. But that isn't necessarily reversing Crenshaw's ideas. The part that's reversing it is, so I fully agree that if people are saying they experience something that is outside your experience, it's an important element of humility that you should be listening and saying, okay, this might actually be something that happened. And indeed, even people who chronically play the victim, they still might have had these things happen. And you can accept that this might have happened to them and it's awful, even if it's outside of your experience. But you don't need intersectionality for that. You just need humility. But the supposedly intersectional approach to this basically will exclude anyone. It goes one way. It goes, and so I've talked about in my Sunday video, Arnold Kling's 3 Languages of Politics. And so it's supposed to only flow from oppressor to oppressed. So you're supposed to only give this benefit of the doubt to people who are talking about their experience on the account of being in a class of people who is the oppressed class. And indeed, not just that, but if it's an intersection that includes any element that would be considered privileged, then you can just dismiss that as well. And Crenshaw actually addresses this. I thought it was in her 1989 paper, but I realized it might actually have been in her 1991 paper. I reread both of these papers a dozen times, like 3 years ago, trying to understand why does everyone seem to be getting this backwards from how I understand it. But Crenshaw points out that there are areas where black men are disadvantaged on the basis of race that black women aren't. So intersectionality isn't just on the basis of intersections of categories of marginalization. And again, I think it's this attitude of assuming it's oppressor, whereas marginalization and privilege is not like a binary thing. There is a spectrum, and there can be disadvantage to being in a privileged category as well, which I think this might be an issue with thinking on the left in general, but it does lead to, in practice, the people who preach this listen and believe approach to intersectionality, they're basically saying, okay, don't listen to anyone who is claiming personal experience on the basis of intersections that include any category that would be an oppressor category. And indeed, this was the reason I got into this. I'll make a whole video in May, but that dynamic was what triggered this for me. So that listen and believe approach to intersectionality, that is getting Crenshaw backwards, because the whole idea is that you're removing barriers to everyone. You're playing the infinite game, and that's making everyone better off. But it's taking, again, the general principle of humility of, okay, people might have experiences that I haven't had, and I should listen, and saying, no, only listen to them if they are claiming this exclusively on the benefit of intersections of oppressed classes, which reverses the whole point, recreates the problem. But this is about 20 to 25% of the discussion of intersectionality I've seen in the wild sort of has this listen and believe account of intersectionality. And I feel like it's still less bad than the other approach, which is 75 to 80% of what I've seen in the wild, which is basically, it is intersectional analysis. So it is, you are counting up marginalization points and deciding based on whoever wins the oppression Olympics gets preference for scarce resources, should get preference for jobs, for scholarships, for even like attention in terms of you're reading their writings or you're listening to what they have to say. And what this leads to in practice, and this is where Crenshaw's 1991 paper comes in, because she points out that, so it basically becomes a game of who can make the best case that they are most marginalized. And you see a lot of fights over this. And again, there are scarce resources, there are constraints, but it ends up privileging the people who generally have the educational and wealth background to articulate the argument that either they are most disadvantaged, or even worse, that they are an ally of some class who is disadvantaged, who rarely has the education and connections to speak for themselves. And they'll go around amplifying marginalized voices of people who claim to be a member of a group who is rarely represented in these discussions, as a means of status seeking, as a means of clout. And so instead of meaningfully reducing barriers for everyone, it becomes this status game, basically promoting the people who are still most relatively privileged, have the but for 1 or 2 steps removed from the top of the basement, but with the extra step of claiming you are performing intersectional analysis and arguing over the results. So I think what's going on is, so again, Kling, the 3 Languages of Politics, people on the left tend to see things through oppressor/oppressed dynamics, especially with like politically highly active and engaged people. And then Thomas Sowell, the unconstrained vision, running up against actual constraints. And you'll see a lot of these people will say, oh, well, this is a temporary thing, but once we abolish capitalism or end patriarchy, we'll do away with these limits. But in the meantime, we should be prioritizing the most marginalized people. And so I think that it's this attitude, because the people who promoted intersectionality are on the left, and so they're filtering it through the unconstrained vision, which Crenshaw herself also seems to believe, and as I said, I have issues with that. And then also through the oppressor/oppressed dynamic, which Crenshaw, at least as I read her writing, does not seem to advocate. She seems to recognize that privilege and marginalization are not a binary distinction, but are a spectrum, and it's complicated. And so it gets what she said, which is basically, ultimately, I would say, boils down to play the infinite game, try to remove the barriers that are stopping the most people from participating in our social institutions. But it becomes, oh, let's fight over status games, where the people who win are the ones who are slightly marginalized but have a lot of privilege except for one or two but-fors. So basically creating the exact thing she was trying to address in her 1989 paper, but with the extra step of performing so-called intersectional analysis. And then I think the people on the right who criticize intersectionality, they see this, they think it's what it is, and then when they read her papers, they are seeing that she is advocating the unconstrained vision, and they are seeing that she's talking about marginalization and privilege, and they're reading it as being strictly oppressor-oppressed. And so they're also saying, when they read these papers, yeah, it makes sense what she is saying. And I have shown her 1989 paper to two people without telling them much about it, asking them how they read it, and they read it the same way as I did, and I'm like, okay, I'm not insane. So there's this Asch conformity experiment, which famously, you have these lines, and if you ask people which line is longer, and everyone is saying the shorter one is longer, most people will go along with it, because it's, I must be crazy if everyone thinks it, but if even one person says that the line is not longer, even if they pick a different shorter line, then people are much more willing to say, yeah, I think it's actually this one that's longer. And so when it was literally everyone I was seeing in the wild was adopting one of these two approaches, of either the listen and believe approach to intersectionality, where again, the humility and empathy only flows down from oppressor to oppressed, and the idea of intersectional analysis, which is recreating the exact thing she set out to criticize, I was like, am I insane? And again, showing it to two people, having them read it without telling them, and having them say, yeah, it's not just you, I'm reading it the same way, was helpful. And then since then, I have run into one person in the wild who actually correctly understood what Crenshaw was saying, and this is the YouTuber Mentis Wave. And he's a libertarian YouTuber who I didn't listen to a lot before, but I watched one of his videos where he did this correctly. He got it correct, and I'm like, wow, I have never seen anyone get this correct in the wild. And he's a critic of intersectionality, but he still got what she was actually saying, and that was like, wow, I've never seen this before. And so I just wanted to talk about this quickly because it's frustrating to me, because although I do have problems with the unconstrained vision, I think that Crenshaw had some really good insights. And it was also really impressive reading, especially her 1989 paper, where she is swimming so much against the grain of how everyone else was thinking. And you see how she has to sort of work to address this, and that she did it in such a short space. That is truly impressive to me, which is one of the reasons I encourage you to read the second half of the paper from the last paragraph of page 11, and don't need to bother with the footnotes. But anyways, just wanted to explain that quickly. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, this is Leela, and I'll see y'all in the next one.